Welcome to the MAGFest 2023 Composers Roundtable. We have plenty. I have the privilege of sitting up here with some phenomenal guests, and I'm going to let you guys get used to the sound of their voices and let them introduce themselves with the project they're most proud of being a part of, and their names and whatever else they feel like sharing. Shall we go down the table?
Sure.
All right.
I'm John Patrick Lowrie. I'm mostly known as a voice actor, but I wrote 5 songs for the game The Church in the Darkness. So that's, but you know, as a voice actor, you probably know me as the sniper and a bunch of folks. I've been in a bunch of games.
Woo! Woo!
Hello, hola mi gente. I am Elisa, also known as Elisa Rockdock on the internet. You might know me as a voice actress, Tyrene Calypso in Borderlands 3, but I am a singer-songwriter for the band now Crimson Echoes, formerly Crimson. And the project that I am most proud of is getting my song Don't Stop placed in Rocksmith 2014. People get to learn how to play my tune. That's awesome.
I'm Austin Wintory. I'm a composer, and I don't know what I'm most proud of. I'm very grateful that the game Journey, sort of keeps taking care of me, as it were, as recently as this morning in the atrium with the orchestra. So that's me.
Hi everyone, my name is Mason Lieberman. I'm primarily an anime and video game composer, and while there are a lot of commercial projects that I'm really proud of, I would say that actually the one that probably means the most to me was working with Yoko Kanno and the Seatbelts on the 2020 Cowboy Bebop official charity vinyl, which was very special.
Hello, I'm Chase Bethea. I'm a professional video game composer. This year marks my 12th year as an independent video game composer in the industry. On the project, thank you. The project I'm most proud of is A Ground, which won the Nix Award for Best Soundtrack of that year, which is played by 3 million players worldwide.
Hi guys, I'm Jake Silverman. Some of you may know me as Button Masher. I'm a chiptune artist. I make a lot of music for old hardware and stuff like that, like jazz fusion. The project I'm most proud of, though, is I recently became one of the first people to ever win a Grammy for a video game cover, along with Charlie Rosen in the 8-Bit Big Band. Thank you.
So we've got, as you can tell, it's a very eclectic group. A lot of different styles of music that this lovely table works in. But the thing that ties us all together, including all of us in the room here and all of us at the convention, is a love of video game music. So I thought we could go down the table again, maybe, and have everyone just give a piece of video game music that either inspired you when you were starting out, or before you were a composer, capital C, and were just wanting to be a composer, maybe, or if it's just something that got you into video games. I want to hear what kind of video game music you guys like.
Tell them who you are.
Oh yeah, sorry. I'm 8-Bit Music Theory.
Right?
I'll be
Way to bury the
moderating.
lead, dude.
Yeah.
But today I'm playing the role of 8-Bit Moderation Theory. No, but yeah, I was asked to come in and ask some hard-hitting questions, so I'm gonna lob some fastballs at these guys. But yes, let's hear what video game music strikes you.
So this is asked me under the theory that I've been traveling faster than the speed of light, so that effect and cause are reversed, right?
Yes.
Because the first video game came out when I was 4,700 years old. So
So long
I
ago.
majored in composition at Indiana University back in the 70s. Yeah, great school. And I formed a fusion guitar duo in the late 70s and early 80s, and wrote a lot of stuff for that. I had already written string quartet, brass quintet, large orchestra piece, small orchestra piece, but this is all before video games were even the twinkle in the eye of their daddy. So, and then I got into acting, and I was doing that for a while, and then video games started to come out, and I started acting in them, and I actually got the gig writing songs for Church in the Darkness when Richard Rouse hired me and Ellen to be husband and wife cult leaders in this really dark, weird game called Church in the Darkness.
Sick.
So video game music didn't influence me. I influenced video game music.
Oh, excellent. I've been surrounded by video games all my life. I wear my love on my sleeve, both of them. I grew up on, like, my favorite game growing up, for some reason, it was Anticipation. The theme song to Anticipation for the NES is, like, lodged in my brain. When I played Legend of Zelda Gold cartridge, because it's got to be on the gold cartridge or else it doesn't work. And then I played Legend of Zelda 2 Link's Awakening, and I heard, and then of course I'm gonna butcher musical terms because I'm self-taught, but like the idea of like an allusion to the previous theme, and then that feeling of I'm playing this game but I know where I am, I feel like I'm home again, that blew my mind. I was like, I didn't know that you could like reharmonize stuff and make an allusion to a theme like that and make me feel like I'm coming back home. That was a really powerful feeling. And the Super Mario World castle theme just frickin' whips. But yeah, musically I'm influenced by everything from Metallica to Weird Al to, like Weird Al is one of my favorite lyricists of all time, like no joke. Scansion is a beautiful thing. So like I absorb everything from anywhere, but I love the idea of like having at least a song that I wrote coming from this background being in a video game is just dope as hell. And I hope I can do more of that.
Woo! So I was a rabid gamer, in fact, long before I was ever into music. And so my kind of go-to was the point and click adventure era. So the Sierra and LucasArts lineages of like Loom, Maniac Mansion, Monkey Island franchise, and then like Space Quest, Police Quest, all those. And so for me, the thing that was like, it came out at exactly the moment where my musical awakening was sort of happening was Grim Fandango. And yeah, that was the first time I remember hearing a score that had such overwhelmingly large numbers of live players. It was 1997, so it was right at the front end of when the software and the hardware could support recordings. And hearing Peter McConnell's score where he went around the Bay Area and got these, jazz and like mariachi musicians that played, they weren't just session players, they had so much soul and personality. And I'm playing this game and hearing just these greasy tenor saxes and things, and it was like, this is substantially real music. And it was just one of those like exact cross paths with me at the moment that I sort of needed it. And so I don't know how one picks a favorite ever game score. It's impossible. There's 10,000 competitors for that. But that's kind of my fallback answer because it's just so freaking great.
Kind of in a similar line with John, I was actually born over 7,000 years in the future. And let me tell you, Super Mario Galaxy 55 is banging. But no, I mean, I think anyone who knows me probably knows the answer to this question. Sonic Adventure 2. Like, come on. Like, I I think that my entire career has just been trying to find ways to convince Crush 40 to respond to my emails. And I've gotten closer than you'd think.
So, Ben, there's never a fair question to ask, right? You know, inspirations, like we can't just choose one, but it's for me it is an amalgamation. I grew up on the Game Boy, so I was writing game music on like the Game Boy Camera in '97, and so before that it would be a sound test for Final Fantasy Legend 2, and Kenji Ito just blew my mind with the 4 channels that you can typically do and put forward, and as you know, that turns into Saga Frontier, and we take it from there. But just the mastery of understanding the compositional layers that go into what that happens is many tears and many days of just, before there was really like a MAGFest, you had your radio and it was your Game Boy, and you figure out the sound test, you just put it up and have it on and just make it in a loop. And but that was Turok buying all the Binosaurs, and then it was Tomb Raider for 1996, Nathan McCree's score, which is the awesome suite. So it's so many inspirations that have definitely got me into this, but it's my heart, it's my home.
So if I had to pick one piece in particular, one definitely comes to mind. Jun Ishikawa is one of my favorite OST composers. He's written most of the music for most Kirby games, but in particular, Kirby Superstar, there's a composition called Grape Garden. And the SPC 700, which is the Super Nintendo sound chip, has 8 available channels. And he maxes out this song at 5, but it sounds like a full orchestra. Like you would never guess that only 5 notes at a time are ever being played. So, and I mean, of course, like compositionally, it's a beautiful piece, but on a technical level, it's also really quite a marvel. So, yeah.
What would your response to this be?
Yeah.
Sorry?
What about you?
What about you, Ben?
Oh, I didn't realize you were the moderator here, Mason.
I've been known to do a little moderation of my time.
I grew up playing Wind Waker as a kid. That was the first game I ever bought with my own money. And then growing up, I kind of thought, well, it's clearly the best game ever made with the best music ever made. But I probably only think that because of nostalgia. But then I got even older and realized, no, it's objectively the best ever made.
Wrong.
But, John, I'm really curious, actually. Being in a room full of people who maybe don't remember a world before sample libraries and digital audio workstations, what was it like learning composition in the 70s?
So this is interesting because I have seen it affect composers. That when you are working with a keyboard that will make a sound that sounds like a trumpet on any note on the keyboard, the one thing that I grieve about is how much harder it is now to learn how instruments work. Because back in the old days, you were actually writing for, the only way you were going to hear it is if human beings played it. And it was so instructive to go into a practice room with a clarinetist and a flautist and a French horn player and an oboist, and periodically through the piece have each one of them go, "What the fuck were you thinking when you wrote that?" And to learn how to make an instrument sound good without making it incredibly difficult, right? How to make music virtuosic so that the player is going to get a great response from the audience without just making it having to woodshed for 8,000 hours to pull it off. And that comes from interacting with players. And I notice I also am part of a professional choir in Seattle that sings soundtracks for movies and video games, stuff like that. And we have noticed that as we've come into the digital age, more and more the singers are asked to behave like keyboards.
Interesting.
You know, whereas somebody like Puccini was writing for the human voice, and he knew where it was going to really ring and where it was going to, you know, where the strongest part of the voice was, and all this kind of stuff. And I just noticed that young composers are not getting trained that way anymore, because they have access to a keyboard that's going to play it for them, and so they think that a voice is going to sound like because they can do it, you know. And it's interesting to me how often we get directed by the conductor to say, yeah, could you not gliss in there? Could it just be like the straight tone and then jump to the next tone? Because that's what the composer is used to hearing when he's been writing it. And so we're trying to reproduce this keyboard sound as singers. And I don't know how that's going to play out, because of course, when the piano came out in the late 18th century, it changed composing forever, because all of a sudden you had a tool as a composer that could play loud and soft, because the piano was originally called the pianoforte because it could play soft and loud. Before that, you had harpsichords and stuff like that you could only play soft. And all of a sudden, music started having dynamics. You look for dynamics in Baroque music, you won't find them. They won't be there at all. It's not written to have dynamics. You're just written to play. And so in the 19th century, we started having, you know, Beethoven and Wagner and Liszt, all these people who were just exploring dynamics all over the place. And already I am seeing how having an entire orchestra sampled and everything else under the sun sampled, where, you know, if I wanted to use traditional musicians and incorporate electronic music into a piece in the 70s, it was a big freaking production. Not only because all of the traditional musicians were looking at me with hatred like I was going to destroy their jobs, right? But we've kind of gotten through that, and the kinds of things that we can produce now so easily were just impossible back in the 70s. But we've lost some of that organic, gritty, you know, you can't get a really good guitar lick out of a keyboard, that kind of thing, you know.
Interesting. I want to jump around here now instead of just going down the line, but feel free to jump in, any of you, whenever you feel like talking. But Austin, looking at your works, you always seem to incorporate really interesting instrument choices, talking about instruments and writing for instruments specifically rather than for a keyboard that sounds like an instrument. Like, whether it's like the, I can't remember what it's called now, but in Journey, there's the big MIDI or like ancient horn.
Serpent.
The serpent.
Right.
Or the pathless, like there are plenty of interesting instruments that Austin has uploaded videos on his YouTube channel detailing the process of writing for the pathless. But I was just wondering, like, do you find a lot of inspiration from instruments specifically, or from unique instruments, or is that more of a?
It's often the performer. I actually heavily resonate with everything that you're saying, because I had one of these incredibly rare and lucky comings of age where I was like I said, I was a gamer before I was even a musician, and I was a computer nerd. I was studying programming and stuff. But when it came to music, my teachers, like my piano teacher, had been a ghostwriter in LA in the 70s, writing for shows like The Streets of San Francisco. And so when I showed interest in writing music, it was like put staff paper in front of me and a pen. And so then I went to high school and I started writing charts for the school orchestra by hand. And I would copy them in the teacher's lounge. And so I learned the basics of orchestration from the podium. And then only later did I realize how absurdly generationally wrong that was. Like, I was the only one my age who had spent, when I went to college and took my first real orchestration class, I'd already spent probably 1,000 hours in front of real orchestra.
Yeah.
And I was the only one in that category. And it was dumb luck. It was just because I had an orchestra teacher in high school that just said, sure, you can come on the podium anytime you want. And I took advantage of that almost every day for the whole 4 years of high school.
And how wonderful it is when you write something, you say, wait a minute, with the saxes playing, I can't hear this. I need to reorchestrate.
Or you learn, and what you said about the practice room with the wind quartet, the number of times that I wrote a thing and then it just sounded horrendous. And you think, you stupid musicians, and they're going, it's badly written. and you never do that again because the computer. I mean, I'm a big advocate for technology, and I love the way that it has democratized music and made people who weren't lucky enough to have a private orchestra the ability to write music. But it is a different training. So yeah, to your question specifically though. Like in the case of Journey, it features a lot of cello solos played by a musician named Tina Guo. Even if you look at the sheet music, it doesn't say cello, it says Tina, because it's written for her. And I write, and like, where I think she had to leave. Kristen Nagus, who was in here, is a woodwind player, oboist, and about 200 others, who I write for very specifically all the time. She plays everything that makes sound when you blow into it, and also theremin. And so...
Plays theremin too?
Yeah.
Theremin's dope. That's awesome.
Yeah, she's a monster. So yeah, for me, and I love the act of discovery. Kristen's actually a really good example because she'll tell me about an instrument she's just discovered that she doesn't know how to play yet, or just like found an instrument maker. So I'll buy it and say, okay, you got a month to work it out, and then tell me how it works, and then we'll write for it. And so that's been a lot of my explorational process.
Very cool. Very cool. On the flip side, Jake, button masher.
Yeah.
You don't write for real instruments now under button masher.
No, I do not.
How have you? But he's a phenomenal.
I would say acoustic instruments because it is a real instrument.
Oh yeah, that's
good point.
Sorry,
good
that's
point.
my
good
mistake.
point.
It is a real
Actually,
instrument.
the best
Yeah,
answer
does
for
really
that
exist.
is, with respect, Senator, I cannot recall.
No, but have you found, because the Super Nintendo sound chip, like writing for that sound chip, are there considerations that you have to make when writing for it, similar to how you'd have to make considerations writing for brass? Or,
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
What kind of things?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different parameters. First of all, like with that sound chip in particular, you're using samples. And depending on how large the sample is that you're using, that's going to determine how long the song can be.
Oh, interesting.
So, particularly if you're trying to export the piece into SPC format, which is how you get it onto a cartridge. And I know, like, this is like, why would you want to do this? Like, I really love the way this music sounds. I grew up with the Super Nintendo, so it's like, I just like, and I was really interested in seeing like what all could be done with that hardware. So like, there's a lot of another thing with the Super Nintendo. There's like you don't have reverb, right? Like, who produces music in here? You know how like, I want reverb, I'll just slap this plugin on here, right? You don't have that with the Super Nintendo. You have echo, which is like this kind of like it's like a very shady sounding delay effect. It's like very, all this stuff is like very lo-fi. So, and you have with that, you can tweak it a little bit in terms of how long the delay is and like how it's panned or whatever. And there's also a fur filter, which is like an EQ for that delay. So there's like there's a lot of interesting parameters when it comes to writing chiptune. One thing you don't have to worry about with chiptune is like, is this playable by a person? Like you can just write the craziest thing you could possibly imagine and see it. So it's it's like, that's true for most electronic music, but
Or you can hire Kristen Nagus and also just write the craziest thing.
Yeah, right. So, there's like a lot of like you have to worry about like what sounds you're using, how many sounds you're using, how much space they're going to take up, and how long the piece is going to be. So yeah, it's definitely a lot of different considerations. You can't write a super long piece like to get onto an SPC, but that's what makes what those composers did that much more amazing. Like that they were working with it, and I'm sure everybody in here can sing a song from Super Nintendo, like Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, Super Mario World. Yep. So yeah.
So this is maybe not pointed at anyone specifically, but when you're working on a game, or working on music in general, I guess. Or no, actually, so Mason and Chase, I want you guys to tag team this actually.
There you go.
When you're working on a soundtrack, I imagine there are times where you get to have, hire musicians to play stuff, and then there are times where you have to just make it work with samples or whatever you have on you. Is there, I guess, how do you approach that? Or like what kind of situations would you say, I'll go with samples, that'll be fine. And what kind do you say, or what situations do you say, I need a real person to record something for me for this?
I would say that it's generally situational based on impact. So like the first thing, whenever you're looking at like the totality of a soundtrack and you're like, oh, I have X thousand or 100,000 in total budget to assess, you're looking at what is going to make the biggest impact, what is going to be most noticeable for the players, what defines this soundtrack, I think that if I were to point to something like what Austin did with Journey, it's like, well, a lot of that's live recorded, but if you were looking at what is the single most impactful thing on that soundtrack, it would be the cello solo. And so probably the first thing, I'm assuming because it's the same way that I would do things, that was probably the first thing that you in your head budgeted for before anything else.
And the biggest line item.
Exactly. Go Tina. And so like for me, I always assess my soundtrack and I go, well, what is the most important thing? When we're dealing with like Apex Legends Mobile or whatever, I know that big brass are an important thing. Like it's just part of the sound and a lot of it is going to be very synth heavy. I don't need to record anything at all for that. I can do most of that either in the box or with analog equipment I've got. But like, I know that if I want the right sound for the big brass, like human beings are going to need to be a part of that equation. And so first things first, I'm going to be budgeting either for a brass ensemble or I'm going to be budgeting for a couple of soloists to layer over things. And that's kind of where it starts.
Interesting. What about you, Chase?
Yeah, so for me, I'm really listening first to what the game is asking me about. And because, as Mason said, I believe in a sonic identity. And it comes from, like Jacob mentioned, that there are sound chips that started out with all of us, right? There's Jake's talking about the SPC 700, it's the sound chip there. We have the YM2612 for the Sega Genesis. Those have sonic identities. It's FM. It's the Super Nintendo sound. So I'm trying to push that still forward, and I'm trying to keep it as best, I'm trying to not have ear fatigue and keep it less monotonous as possible. So I'm a hybrid. I come from old school and I'm pushing new school, and I'm also in the year 55,900. So I believe that it's really dependent upon what the game is asking me first. So I write it and I'm pushing the sound of it, I work specifically with dynamic, interactive, immersive soundtrack now tied to game mechanics. So if you're jumping, there's a reason for it. There's a purpose. And with that purpose comes do I really need this, or is it good enough? Or can I blend? And I'm always experimental. I'm being the child in myself with this because it's the child that brought me forward to this point that I'm here now. And I know that I'm going to be inspiring another child that's going to come up and be hopefully on this panel in 5,005 year, right? So I'm trying to make that happen for them and keep that inspiration going. So it's about, again, first sonic identity, what the game is asking for, the experimentation, and the childhood curiosity.
Elisa, with your band.
Hi.
Do you, the answer might be both, but do you find when you're writing songs, when you're writing music, do you find inspiration from, different sounds and experimenting and things, or do you kind of write a song and then how do I use music to serve the song? Or is it a mixture of both?
Wow. So kind of to the earlier question about composing back then versus now. When I came up, in the late 90s, and started writing music, basically musical theater nerd, the way that I write is I'm in a car or in the shower or in the most inconvenient place. A spark of inspiration will hit me, and then I'll just sing what I can't say. So lyrics and melody come pretty much simultaneously. And then once I have enough of a verse chorus kind of thing, maybe a little bit of an idea, I'm not trained for jack. But my husband is. He went to jazz school at the University of Miami.
Go Frost, good program.
So for 22 years, I have been giving this man, singing at this boy, and being like, what chords fit under this? and bless him, I apparently preferred D and D minor. that just comes out of my face naturally, I guess. So then it's his job to be like, hey, you've written like the last 3 or 4. Can we like transpose this, like take it up a half step? And then he's like, I hear you're implying this, but can we do this? Because maybe it's a little hipper. I'm like, yeah. I mean, as long as it sounds good when I'm singing on top of it, it's cool. So then usually what ends up happening is we'll craft things to be kind of acoustic duo type stuff. And then that's kind of how we like play out a little bit as an acoustic duo thing. And then the rest of the band now, scattered to the 4 winds, we all used to live in Miami together. So back then it was classic, get in a room together, work it out. You know, Evan essentially was my musical director as well for Crimson Echoes. And so he'd teach everybody else what to play. Then we'd go in the studio and try to bang it out, right? But now, we're all scattered to the 4 winds. I'm actually feeling some kind of inspiration again, and I have GarageBand in front of me and a little MIDI thing, and I'm still learning, and I'm doing things like, you know, drum beats like boop, 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 ka-ka, you know, and I'm trying to sort of like do a little bit of that and experiment with that a little bit more, which has been really cool, because now I feel sort of influenced by that vibe, and I feel very much like I'm entering my like Carly Rae Jetpack, the midnight bowling alley carpet era of Crimson Echoes a little bit. So that's kind of the process as it has been. It shows up as an acoustic duo. He tries to figure out what the heck I'm implying. And then we take it to the rest of the band, and for this latest EP, they recorded their parts separately in their own studios, which has been an absolute blast, because 3 of the songs I wrote with them in Miami, and it's taken this long to finally get them recorded. And then one of them is fresh, like since we moved away. So it was kind of an interesting process of having this new song, like, be kind of put together piecemeal, but it's been a fun journey. And now we're in the process of doing guitar solo stuff. And instead of going to a studio like we usually did, and it'd be like, all right, Marshall half stack, give me a Bogner, I want the jug. I want the jug. My husband now, he went from analog, now he has a Helix, right? And so like he's been like, now we can be in our home studio, and it's the best thing in the world. I get to hear him noodle over everything on a loop and hear him recording solos in real time just from our home. That's kind of been the process now, and it's been really cool. So now I'm excited to go home, because we are in guitar solo, segment of the tracking of the EP. So I just get to bask and hear his,
Very
so
cool.
awesome.
John, do you have any tips if someone either needs to write some music or wants to write some music and has no inspiration? Do you have anything that you do to deal with that?
Okay. So I think that the scariest thing about writing music is coming up with the first note. Because if you haven't written the first note yet, the possibilities are infinite. As soon as you write the first note, the possibilities are now finite. When you write the second note, you now have a relationship between 2 notes. And that becomes a musical identity. I think that the most valuable thing to get your head around is the idea of economy of means. A lot of music I hear written by young composers, and by young I mean that haven't written very much, is that there's way too much music in their music. If you, I mean, you guys probably aren't familiar with Wagner, except that you've all seen The Lord of the Rings. And the Wagnerian idea of a leitmotif, when Siegfried comes on stage, he has his own melody. When Siegfried finds his sword, the sword has its own melody. And every time throughout this 19-hour story that is the Ring cycle, you always know who's on stage because this melody comes in. And to your point of we're reincorporating a melody. And in improv, in comedy improv or theatrical improv, we'd call it reincorporation. But the less material you can create a piece of music out of, the better it's going to be. simply because of that economy of means. Our ears hear something, and that becomes an identity. If they hear something else, that's a new identity. If you're writing a novel and you introduce 57 characters in the first chapter, nobody's going to know anybody, right? It's the same thing. If you introduce a melody and then another melody that contrasts the first melody, you can go, I mean, you could write a 20-minute piece of music just with that. So I think the other thing that helps that a lot of people, I mean, I love improv. I love improvisation completely. But architecture is such a powerful tool. I'll throw out some things that'll just scare everybody. Rondo form, sonata allegro form, theme and variations, all that classical crap. But in fact, they're just tools. They're just tools. If you have those forms, you can say, okay, I want to write a sonata allegro form, or you can say, no, I don't want to write a sonata allegro form, but I can use the sonata allegro form as a jumping off point. And there is a thing, particularly when you're writing a long piece of music, you need to be able to tell as a composer when you're a third of the way through, when you're 2/3 of the way through. If you're just writing notes and then some more notes and then some more notes and then some more notes, your listener is not going to know where they are. And so, golden section. Bela Bartok used the golden section. He'd have the climax at 62% of the way through the piece, right? And he'd know it. And he'd say, okay, this is it. And and he'd actually put minutes and seconds up to this point.
Interesting.
So that kind of thinking architecturally, I always like to compare it to walking into a house that was designed by an architect and walking into a house that was designed by a carpenter, right? Carpenter gets together, well, okay, we'll put a wall up here, we'll put a wall up here, that'll be cool, we need a door here, so like that. You have an architect and they kind of figure out the whole thing first. And so that kind of architecture and structure and economy of means.
Nice. Mason, does that strike a chord with you?
Like every single thing. Like, oh my God, when I say that everything that John just dropped is gold and is like 1,000% like what probably all of us were taught when we were respectively learning music or are things that we use on a day-to-day basis, I am a huge believer. The silence thing in particular and having space in your music, something that I think about a lot when I'm writing, and I mean an absolute lot, is a phrase that I think about constantly is just, I once had a teacher be like, you don't need to use that now. And I was always a very hyperactive person. I always have a lot of musical ideas. I never feel like I have lack for inspiration. And I always want to throw in things and be like, oh man, it would be so cool if we had a counter melody here doing that. And oh man, let's have a reharmonization going on here. And oh, let's change the time signature here to do this and this and this. And it made me realize that I was starting to fall into this trap that I call music for musicians, which is some of my favorite music to listen to. But when you're working on something commercially, when you're working on something that needs to hit a wide audience, it's not about writing something uncomplicated because the audience isn't sophisticated enough to handle it. That's not the thing at all. It's about writing something simple enough that it connects to people across cultures and around the world. My entire career has been writing for audiences in Japan and in South Korea, in China, in America, in all across Europe, and all these different places for different franchises. And when everyone has very different, diverse musical interests and backgrounds and things they grew up listening to, the cultural touchstone points are different. And so the things that will work across that wide range of listeners becomes much more complicated to reach, but also requires a lot more simplicity. And so, the sense of space, the sense of time, the idea of, I don't need to do everything right in this moment. I can take the time to explore this one musical idea and trust that if I am, architecturally building it out in a meaningful way, and I'm connecting it to my narrative, and I really have a reason why I'm doing this, people will understand that. They will see that story that you're trying to tell. And also on the subject of the, various forms of all these music theory terms that we talk about, something that I think that Ben would certainly agree with, music theory is not a dirty word that, makes you less creative at what you do. it also doesn't make you write in a certain way. Music theory is grammar, and grammar doesn't tell you how to talk. It helps you understand how to explain what has been said. So music theory is a language that allows us to communicate across different types of genres, primarily with Western music as our basis in this particular case. It doesn't work for everything, but there are other types of theory that do work better in those contexts. It provides you a shared language so that when we end up on like a recording stage in front of an orchestra and something doesn't work, we don't need to go, that wasn't right. How do we fix it? We can go, yeah, so actually this voicing is feeling really dense. Can we drop the third from the woodwind section? And actually, I want a little bit more space in the voicing, so in low brass and in bass, let's drop down one octave, and let's get a little bit more going here. And music theory is what gives you, like, that is music theory. That gives you the language to communicate with other musicians. And it works in every single level of music you could possibly make.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing about that is to remember that music theory is not prescriptive, it is descriptive.
Yep.
The first music theory treatise was written in the 18th century, basically describing how Palestrina wrote music in the 16th century or the 15th century. And then for 2 centuries after that, everybody thought, oh, this is how we have to write music, until Debussy said, why? And started writing it some other way. Once again, and I love carpenters. I mean, music theory gives you tools, but imagine going to a carpenter saying, hi, I need a cutting board. And he brings out his hammer and his bandsaw and his band sander and his lathe and every tool, and he uses every tool to make this cutting board, when really all he needed was one saw. And
You need $15.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and jumping in, just writing kind of pop rock music, and not being trained with any of these terms, but, learning over, 22 years of osmosis. It's sometimes it's not theme, sometimes it's just like intro, verse, chorus, verse, slightly shorter, right back into the chorus. Always got to give my hubby a guitar solo. And then last chorus, and then usually what I try to do is also sometimes think of it lyrically, because sort of telling a story, usually the last chorus will have like a flip in a line or something that kind of brings the whole thing together. And there's also, which I don't know if this is on your list of questions, the idea of technology kind of influencing songwriting. Like, has anybody seen The Bridge? Are we losing bridges now? And me thinking about all right, well maybe, I gotta get folks' attention within maybe the first 30 seconds of something. Or you have to get to the chorus in less, in the first minute, or you're toast. And those are kinds of some of the kind of structural things that I think about. But generally it's did I tell the story? Does it have a sick guitar solo? Is some part of it harmonized? Is there a key change? I'm just trying to satisfy myself and put all of the things that I love. I apparently love secondary dominance is a thing that I discovered. Can we have one of those? I love the Mellotron and No Doubt's Tragic Kingdom. Beautiful Mellotron in there. I'm can I have a Mellotron in this one, please? So I'm asking for all of these things, and then sometimes it's well, we can dial it back. Maybe not the whole thing, but maybe we do it on the second chorus to give a little bit of a build. So that's kind of that approach too.
Austin and Chase, you mentioned too. You guys both work with dynamic soundtracks a lot, right? Music that will change and adapt to the player's input or the situation in game. Because, as we all know, games are a very unique medium in that there's not a set amount of time it takes to finish one or to finish a part of one, right? So does your approach to architecture, to kind of bird's eye view, how am I going to structure this music, does that change when you're working with a dynamic piece? Does it change a lot or even just a little bit? Are there lots of considerations? Or is it pretty similar to writing a static piece of music, but then with more stuff to do?
take us away. I have lots of thoughts.
We both have lots to we'll be here this the remaining end of the panel, right? So like I was saying earlier, I'm really just listening to the game. I did a keynote for Global Game Jam last year, and the theme of it is every game has a pulse. And so I'm really looking for that pulse when I'm reading a game design document, or I'm looking at art, or I'm playing the build. And the point of it overall, excuse me, is that it needs to make sense. I'm not just inserting something in there for it to just be there. I really believe that when the tools, there's an ambiguity of what's going on with the player. And so I don't know what the player is going to change an environment for, but what I'm also thinking about is that whatever the mechanics are for the game is that it serves the purpose for the player overall. And so when I'm pre-designing and I'm writing on index cards, I'm thinking about what are these mechanics and how can it musically affect the player to be even more engaged. Let's talk about Luminous Plus, right? Let's talk about these other dynamic like Batman Arkham City with the fights and the other things, and Shadow of Mordor, and all these other cool dynamic music example, Ghost of Tsushima with the tier system of the battle combat system. I can go on, but these are the things that are really engaging and pushing it forward. And so I'm taking these other designs and I'm thinking, what if you change the music based off of just changing an item? Well, I want to use this bottle, music change. Why did I do it? Well, it's subtle, it's cool, I think, but it's not just a steady loop. And so I think it's just mostly important to always, I'm a player first, period. I'm a player first, and then I'm a musician and a designer afterwards.
Yeah.
So yeah, I largely echo that, and to your points about just the incredible importance of architecture, the thing that I think is so fascinating about heavily dynamic interactive music is that the more nonlinear it is, the more it resists architectural construction, because you're leaving something up to a player who doesn't care or has no reason to even be aware of that. So it becomes this interesting challenge of going, how do I, instead of it being me telling them a story, and also it not being them fully creating their own, how do we co-author a story?
Uh-huh.
So I'm creating a tool set, especially to Chase's point, the game is going to give you different ways to do this. So a game like Journey, broadly speaking, Journey is a pretty linear game, but moment to moment, it's not. It's debatable, I suppose, but it has a fairly predictable sequence of events. So that was one where, for example, I like to make really clear architectural markers in my score. So in the case of Journey, as Mason pointed out, the cello is kind of the sort of heart and soul of the sound. And I start to gradually add more layers of the orchestra the closer you get to the end. And it's funny because people think of it as an orchestral score because the ending is sort of the most memorable moment of the game. But that's really the only time you actually hear anything that you could call orchestral, because I've been slowly feeding them in so that it feels like an inevitable culmination and not just a thing I've slathered on left and right. And that was done like incredibly in a very measured way. A different example of when games really throw these cool challenges at you is like on Assassin's Creed Syndicate. I remember going to the folks at Ubisoft and saying, this is like the one weakness I think you consistently have in these games, is because it's a totally open world. Now we're in a fully nonlinear bit of game design. How do we tell them that they are nonetheless making some kind of forward progress in a story? Because there is still fundamentally a story. It's not a toy box or a sandbox in the purest sense, like Minecraft or something. This is a story. So we need to build in these markers. So it was one of those where I went to the programmers and I said, here's my pitch. There was a combination of a lot of folks on the team, because for the dynamic system, I said, I'd like to impose a 3-act structure on the player's playtime that is based on what they do, not based on how much time they've spent with anything. So, conveniently, there were 9 primary narrative missions. Now, there's a million side missions, and so I said the compromise we're gonna have to make is that they operate in a different reality. But as you chip away at the narrative missions, the entire palette of the score evolves. So it starts off, or the first third of the gameplay revolves principally around a violin and cello, which is, again, that's another part of the dynamic system. You can play as 2 characters in the game, and so I wanted to attach one sound to each one. So every cue had to be written with the possibility of you switching mid-phrase, and the music would sort of hand off to the other soloist. So there's that consideration, and there's also like day and night and a lot of other things going on. But the main one is you start off with just this principal soloist, and then 2 or 3 violins only, like a violin trio. Then as you get to the middle of the game, we expand it to 9 strings, 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, and then 2 flutes and 2 oboes used in a very, very kind of sparse way. And then if you get to the third act of the game, we get rid of the winds, we keep the 9 strings, and we add 2 trumpets. And so that it's all chamber music, it's all this very intimate ensemble, but the color is shifting and the musical vocabulary is changing. It starts off, very kind of simple, and it's getting more and more dense and complicated. And it's knowing when to make those changes based on your progress in the narrative missions. And what that also entailed, which they weren't wild about, was I said, I'm going to write a boatload of music to cover all these in-world events, and then however many hours later, we're going to jettison all of it and it's all gone. Because if we keep it in, they won't perceive anything has changed. We have to be willing to let it go.
Right.
And so then it was, there's going to be a huge bucket of music that has to be removed and an entirely new one of equal size to brought in to replace it. So it's not the most efficient thing because it requires a huge amount of content. But that way, you have this moment where you come around the corner, you get into your first fight, and those trumpets come in, and you're like, "Holy shit! I'm in a new place. This is different now," and you feel it. So it's every game. How you solve this is one of the things I love about scoring games. Every game is so different in how the player engages with them. Again, to Chase's point, so perfectly put. Always think about what is the player experiencing. Don't get excited to be a musician's composer. You are writing for the player's experience. So what will they meaningfully remember, and how do we latch on to that, whatever that is?
Yeah, I like to call that, will this piece of music get me laid?
It's always worked for me.
I get to sleep with GLaDOS every night, so yeah, I'd have to say yes.
This was a triumph.
Just to note, by the way, we will be lining up outside the door after this panel to offer to buy John a beer.
Well, I feel like we could sit up here and do this for another hour, but we have like 3 more minutes left, and I thought if any of you have a question for the lovely panel. Yes, sir.
Should I just yell it out?
Just yell it out. Or, just yell it out.
Okay. There's a lot of discussion on basically instrumental sort of orchestrating writing for video game music. And we're in a space right now where we're coexisting alongside electronic space. And I'm wondering how that, redefines our notion of what is idiomatic, even what is virtuosic. When I think about, you're talking about economy of means, right?
Uh-huh.
There was a time in which, you could hire at most up to, 5 musicians, and you'd have a chamber ensemble, and you think, okay, how do I, use 5 musicians in the most impressive way possible to create the best music, right? But now, in a 2-minute piece with a form that is entirely new for electronic music, right? I can look at a Logic file and see, 100 tracks just lined up because they don't have that sort of limit.
Go ahead.
So I think that this is kind of a trick question to a degree, because oftentimes our challenge isn't about how do we create the most impressive thing. All of us, especially in media, we're here to tell stories. And sometimes maybe the story requires you to think of what would be the most impressive way for this music to present itself. But a lot of times it really doesn't. It's about how do we represent these characters, this world, this emotional journey that they're on. So yes, certainly if you're talking about how do you assess, what is or isn't impressive, the metrics that we might use with an acoustic ensemble might be different than what Jake would be listening for with an electric one. But as storytellers, it's all actually the exact same thing at the end of the day. And it's the same in music as it is in voice acting, as it is in art, as it is in anything else. It's, are you reaching this story?
Well, I'd say, to the economy of means, in your score, as a player, I might have all kinds of experiences from all of the music that is generated out of a very economical structure. But as I'm listening to it as a composer, that's it. We got 3 strings, then we have 9 strings, then we have trumpets. There are only 3 things in this music. That's economy of means. You listen to Coltrane's version of of my favorite things,
Literally
economy of
think about
means, they can go anywhere forever.
Yeah.
But with a very, very simple vocabulary, right? So that was more what I was talking about.
I mean, personally, I think of like some electronic tracks that I've heard that switch genres, entire genres, back to back, like every 15 seconds, and that sort of seems almost natural, almost enjoyable at this point. At this point. So, I mean, when I think of that, I just wonder, like, what is the place for restrictions that might have come back from previous times of having these restrictions on number of people on acoustic ensembles, and now that we're basically, you can press a button, have a sample pack, and have like a distorted trombone and playing be natural.
Right, but of course, I mean, so the difference is between vocabulary and talking. All right, I mean, if you can put together a really complex speech using only two concepts, it'll be amazing just because of that. That is virtuosic in itself.
Yeah. Did I understand you? Did I feel something? Does it whip?
Will it get you laid? Right.
Does it whip?
That
Does
feels
it
like
whip?
a great spot for us to end on.
Does
is,
it
does
whip?
it whip?
Just does it whip?
Did they whip? Thank you guys so much for coming. That is our time for the panel. But I had a blast up here with all of these lovely
Thank you,
people.
sir.
Thank you for hosting us, Ben.
A bit.
Everyone give it up for Ben.
And I hope you guys have a great rest of the con.
Stream Crimson Echoes.